through the wilderness of Montana. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks dusted with snow even in late spring. For Daniel Carter, a seasoned wilderness guide, the Rockies had always been a second home. But this trip was different. What began as a routine expedition with two clients, brothers Michael and Eric, eager city dwellers chasing adventure, had turned into a fight for survival. The disaster struck suddenly. A rogue storm descended from the peaks, turning the serene Montana wilderness into a raging tempest. Wind howled through the forest, uprooting trees and sending debris flying. Torrential rain transformed the trails into rivers of mud. In the chaos, Daniel and the brothers were separated. When the storm finally subsided, Daniel found himself alone, disoriented, and far from the planned route. His first thought was the brothers. They weren't skilled in wilderness survival, and the Rockies were unforgiving. "Michael! Eric!" he called, his voice echoing through the empty forest. Only silence answered. Daniel leaned against a pine tree, catching his breath and assessing his situation. His pack was intact, but the map and GPS were gone, lost in the storm. All he had was a knife, a water bottle, and the knowledge of the wilderness etched into his memory from years of guiding. He decided to head north, toward the river they'd planned to follow. Water was life in the wilderness, and the brothers might instinctively do the same. As he moved, the forest around him felt strange. The Rockies were familiar, but something was off. The usual hum of wildlife was muted, and the shadows beneath the trees seemed deeper, darker. Hours passed, and the dense forest seemed to close in on Daniel. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig put him on edge. He wasn't one to spook easily, but the oppressive silence gnawed at him. He stumbled upon a small clearing where a crude campsite had been left abandoned. The fire pit was cold, but the marks on the ground were fresh. "Michael? Eric?" he called again, his voice breaking the eerie stillness. As he approached the site, he noticed something odd. Symbols carved into the rocks around the fire pit. They were unlike anything he'd seen before. Spirals, crosses, and jagged lines that seemed to pulse faintly in the fading daylight. Kneeling closer, Daniel felt an inexplicable unease. The carvings were intricate, yet chaotic, as if whoever made them had been in a frenzy. He shook his head and stood, pushing the thoughts aside. He had to focus on survival and finding the brothers. As dusk fell, Daniel made his own camp by a creek. He set up a small fire and ate sparingly from his provisions, his ears straining for any sound that wasn't the crackling of flames or the babble of the creek. As he sat, his mind wandered back to the strange carvings. Who had made them? And why? He was pulled from his thoughts by a distant sound, a low, mournful howl. It was unlike any wolf he had ever heard, deeper and more resonant. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He grabbed his knife and moved closer to the fire, the blade feeling woefully inadequate against the unknown. The howl came again, closer this time. Daniel scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, his heart pounding. Shadows shifted in the trees, but he couldn't tell if it was his imagination or something real. Then he saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, amber and unblinking, staring at him from the edge of the forest. The creature stayed just out of the firelight, its silhouette massive and unnervingly still. "Get out of here!" Daniel shouted, brandishing the knife. His voice carried no confidence, only desperation. The eyes blinked once, and then the creature retreated silently into the forest. Daniel didn't sleep that night, his fire burning until dawn. The next morning, Daniel continued his trek, his muscles stiff from exhaustion. He reached the river by midday and felt a brief surge of relief. If the brothers were alive, they might have followed the water, just as he had hoped. But as he followed the riverbank, he found something that froze him in his tracks. Eric's jacket, snagged on a low-hanging branch. It was torn and smeared with mud, but there was no sign of the brothers. "Eric! Michael!" he shouted, his voice cracking. This time, there was a response. A faint, wavering voice carried by the wind. "Daniel." He turned toward the sound, his pulse quickening. It was coming from deeper in the forest, away from the river. Against his better judgment, Daniel followed, calling out, "Eric? Michael? Where are you?" The voice came again, closer this time. "Daniel." It wasn't right. The tone was off, too calm, almost monotone. Daniel slowed his pace, gripping his knife tightly. The forest around him grew darker, the air colder, as if the sun had been blotted out. The voice led him to another clearing, this one dominated by a massive stone formation. The carvings were here too, larger and more detailed. They covered the stones, spiraling up toward a jagged peak. At the base of the formation, a figure knelt, its back to Daniel. "Eric?" Daniel called hesitantly, stepping closer. The figure didn't respond. As Daniel moved closer, dread pooled in his stomach. The figure turned its head, and Daniel's blood ran cold. It wasn't Eric, it wasn't Michael, it wasn't human. The thing grinned, its face twisted and wrong. "Daniel," it whispered, its voice a mockery of his name. Daniel stumbled back, fear gripping him. The creature rose, impossibly tall, its form shifting as it stepped toward him. He turned and ran, the forest closing in around him, the thing's laughter echoing in his ears. He didn't stop until the trees parted and he collapsed by the river, gasping for breath. The wilderness of Montana was no longer just wild, it was alive, and it was hunting him. Daniel woke by the river at dawn, his body aching from exhaustion. The memory of the night before lingered in his mind like a bad dream. The glowing eyes, the creature in the clearing, and the unnatural voice calling his name. He wanted to believe it was a hallucination brought on by fear and fatigue, but the torn jacket he'd found told him otherwise. He rose slowly, splashing water from the river onto his face. The cold shock cleared his head but did little to ease his growing dread. Somewhere out there, Michael and Eric were either in danger or worse. And now, Daniel was beginning to feel like he was part of something he didn't understand. He decided to move upstream, reasoning that if the brothers had followed the river, they might have been forced to climb higher ground to avoid the rocky rapids. The terrain was rough, and every step felt heavier than the last, but Daniel's determination kept him moving. The forest around him was alive with sound, bird calls, rustling leaves, and the occasional crack of a branch. Yet, every so often, the sounds would stop, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to press on his ears. By midday, Daniel came across another clue, Michael's backpack, snagged in the roots of a tree by the riverbank. It was soaked but intact, the contents spilling out onto the ground. A flashlight, a canteen, and a bundle of trail mix lay scattered in the mud. Daniel crouched, sifting through the items. His fingers brushed against a notebook, a weathered journal that Michael had been carrying throughout the trip. Daniel flipped it open, the pages warped from water damage. The last entry, hastily scrawled, sent a chill down his spine. "We heard it again last night. It's closer now. Eric says it's the wind, but I know better. Something's out there, watching us, following us. I'm scared we won't make it out." The words sent a surge of fear through Daniel's chest. He closed the journal and stuffed it into his own pack. Whatever had happened to the brothers, it wasn't a simple case of getting lost. Something or someone had been hunting them. As he continued, the forest seemed to shift. The trees grew taller and denser, their gnarled branches twisting like claws. The air felt heavier, tinged with a metallic tang that Daniel couldn't place. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, casting the forest floor in an eerie twilight. That's when he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of the river. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the cadence was unmistakable. Words, his name. "Daniel." He froze, his pulse quickening. "Michael?" "Eric?" he called, his voice echoing through the trees. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Daniel." He turned toward the sound, gripping the hilt of his knife. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows deepening. He took a cautious step forward, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. And then he saw it, a figure, partially obscured by the undergrowth. It was hunched and motionless, its back to him. For a moment, hope flared in Daniel's chest. "Michael?" he called out, taking another step. The figure didn't move. Daniel approached slowly, back his knife at the ready. As he drew closer, dread began to replace his hope. The figure's posture was unnatural, its limbs too long, its body too still. "Michael?" Daniel said again, his voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, and Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't Michael. The face that looked back at him was pale and hollow, its eyes sunken and black as voids. It grinned, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched impossibly across its face. "Daniel," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Daniel stumbled back, his heart hammering. The creature tilted its head, its grin widening. "You shouldn't be here," it said, the words slithering through the air like a hiss. Without thinking, Daniel turned and ran. Branches clawed at his face and arms as he tore through the undergrowth, his breath ragged. The whispers followed him, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Daniel! Daniel! Daniel!" He didn't stop until he tripped over a root and fell hard onto the forest floor. Gasping for air, he scrambled to his feet, spinning around to face his pursuer. But the forest was silent again, the whispers gone. Only the sound of his own breathing filled the air. Daniel leaned against a tree, trying to calm his racing heart. He knew he couldn't keep running blindly. He had to think, to focus. Whatever was out here, it wasn't natural, but he couldn't let it stop him. Michael and Eric were still out there, and he wasn't going to abandon them. He pulled out the journal again, flipping to the earlier entries. One line stood out. "The carvings by the river, they mean something. Eric says they're old, but I think they're a warning." Carvings. Daniel remembered the strange symbols he'd seen the previous night near the abandoned campsite. He hadn't thought much of them then, but now he wasn't so sure. Perhaps they were connected to whatever was happening here. Perhaps they held the key to surviving this nightmare. He resolved to find the carvings again, hoping they would provide some answers. Taking a deep breath, Daniel steeled himself and turned back toward the river. The wilderness of Montana was alive with secrets, and if he was going to survive, he needed to uncover them before it was too late. The river's constant murmur was Daniel's only companion as he retraced his steps, his mind racing with fear and determination. The carvings, the ones Michael had mentioned in his journal, might hold the key to understanding the terror that had overtaken the wilderness. Whatever was hunting him wasn't natural, and he needed answers before it was too late. As Daniel moved through the dense forest, the oppressive atmosphere returned. The air felt heavy, thick with an energy that made his skin crawl. The trees seemed closer, their twisted branches forming unnatural shapes that cast sinister shadows. Despite the overwhelming dread, Daniel pushed forward, his knife clutched tightly in his hand. Hours passed before he reached the clearing. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the rocks and trees. In the center of the clearing stood the stone formation, its surface etched with the strange symbols he had seen before. They glowed faintly now, their lines pulsating as if alive. Daniel approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the edges of the clearing for any sign of movement. The forest was eerily silent, save for the faint hum emanating from the carvings. He crouched by the stones, tracing the markings with his fingers. They felt warm to the touch, almost alive. "What are you trying to tell me?" Daniel muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. As if in response, the humming grew louder. The symbols flared, casting the clearing in a flickering light. Daniel stumbled back as a deep, resonant voice filled the air, vibrating through his chest. "You trespass on sacred ground." The voice was ancient, neither human nor animal, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Daniel looked around, his heart pounding. "Who's there? What do you want?" The voice responded, calm but filled with power. "This land is not yours to claim. You have disturbed its balance. Now you must choose." The air in the clearing shimmered, and a figure materialized before him. It was humanoid but otherworldly, its form shifting like smoke and light. Its face was featureless, yet its presence was overwhelming. Daniel took a step back, gripping his knife. "What are you talking about? I'm just looking for my friends." The figure tilted its head, as though studying him. "Your kind comes with greed and destruction, taking what is not yours. These mountains remember, these forests endure. Those who trespass pay the price." Daniel's mind raced. Was this creature responsible for the strange happenings? For Michael and Eric's disappearance? He forced himself to stand his ground. "If you've taken them, give them back. I'll leave, I swear. Just let us go." The figure extended a hand, and the clearing shifted. The air rippled, and suddenly Daniel was no longer alone. Michael and Eric were there, standing a few feet away. But something was wrong. Their eyes were hollow, their movements unnatural, as though they were puppets on invisible strings. "Daniel." Michael's voice was flat, emotionless. "You shouldn't have come." Daniel's blood ran cold. "Michael, Eric, what did you do to them?" The figure spoke again. "They belong to the mountains now." A warning to others who would dare disturb the balance. "No," Daniel shouted, stepping toward his friends. "Take me instead. Let them go." The figure paused, its head tilting once more. "A bold offer, but their fates are sealed. You, however, may yet serve a purpose." The symbols on the stone began to glow brighter, their pulsating rhythm growing faster. The ground trembled beneath Daniel's feet, and the air crackled with energy. The voice grew louder, filling his mind. "Choose, Daniel Carter. Become a guardian of these lands, bound to their will or share their fate." Daniel's chest tightened. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing. He couldn't leave his friends to whatever this was. He had to act, even if it meant sacrificing himself. "What does it mean to be a guardian?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its form towering over him. "You will protect these lands, ensure their balance, and ward off those who would harm them. You will belong to the mountains as they belong to you, but you will never leave." Daniel hesitated, his mind reeling. The thought of being trapped in this wilderness forever was terrifying, but the alternative was unthinkable. He took a deep breath, meeting the figure's gaze, or what he thought was its gaze. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "Just let them go." The figure nodded, and the symbols on the stone flared one final time. But the energy surged through the clearing, wrapping around Daniel like a storm. Pain shot through his body as the carvings burned into his skin, marking him as one with the mountains. He fell to his knees, gasping for air. When he looked up, Michael and Eric were gone. The clearing was empty, the stones silent. The figure stood before him, its form fading. "Your sacrifice is noted. The balance is restored." Daniel awoke by the river, the symbols still etched into his skin. The air felt different, calmer, quieter. He rose unsteadily, his body aching but alive. The forest no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it seemed to welcome him, its whispers gentle and familiar. Michael and Eric's fates weighed heavily on him, but he knew they were free now, beyond this world. Daniel had traded his freedom for theirs, and though he was bound to the wilderness, he felt a strange sense of peace. From that day forward, Daniel became a part of the mountains, a guardian of their secrets, a protector of their balance. Travelers who ventured too far into the wilderness often spoke of a figure watching over them, guiding them back when they strayed too close to danger. They called him the Spirit of the Rockies, a legend born from sacrifice and survival. The wilderness had taken much from Daniel, but in the end, it had given him a purpose. The Rockies were no longer a place to escape, they were his home, and he would protect them for as long as the mountains stood.